So let's now learn how we can listen for events and also handle events in our MVC architecture by using something called the publisher-subscriber pattern. And let's start by analyzing the code that we already have here. So right now we are listening for the hash change and for the load events right here in the controller. However, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Because everything that is related to the DOM, so to the view, should really be inside of a view. Now, maybe these two events here don't really look as if they have to do with the view, so with the user interface, but imagine that instead we would be handling a click event on some DOM element. And so listening for that event should for sure go into the view. And therefore we can say the same about these events here. So in the end, this has more to do with DOM manipulation or with the DOM itself than actually with the controller. And so therefore we need a way of putting this logic here into the recipe view. However, the handler function that we use to handle these events is actually this controller. So it's this function that we have up here that is sitting inside of this controller module. And so we have basically a problem here. We don't want this code to be here, so we want it to be in the view. But in this code, we need this controller function, which is here in this module. And of course, we don't want to put this function in the view. And so let's now think about how we could solve this problem. And recapping everything that I just said before, we can basically say that we want to handle events in the controller because otherwise we would have application logic in the view. And of course, we don't want that. But on the other hand, we want to listen for events in the view because otherwise we would need DOM elements in a controller. And we would basically have presentation logic in a controller, which would be wrong in our MVC implementation. So essentially, event listeners should be attached to DOM elements in the view, but the events should then be handled by controller functions that live in the controller module. And so if you take a look at this small diagram that is just a part of the architecture diagram that we already saw before, so here we have the control recipes function in the controller, and we have a special method in the view, which is called add_handler_render. Now, we might think that it is very easy to connect these two functions. Because why not simply call the control recipes function right from the view whenever an event occurs? Well, that's actually not possible because in the way we set up the architecture, the view does not know anything about the controller. So it doesn't import the controller, and so we can't call any of the functions that are in the controller from the view. So it only works the other way around, and therefore it's more complex than this. But fortunately, there is a good solution. And this solution is called the publisher-subscriber design pattern. And by the way, design patterns in programming are basically just standard solutions to certain kinds of problems. So in the publisher-subscriber pattern, we have a publisher, which is some code that knows when to react. And in this case, that's going to be the add_handler_render function because it will contain the add_event_listener method. And therefore, it will know when to react to the event. Now, on the other hand, we have a subscriber, which is code that actually wants to react. So this is the code that should actually be executed when the event happens. And in this case, that is the control recipes function that we already have in our controller. And remember that the publisher does not know yet that the subscriber even exists, because that subscriber is in the controller that the view cannot access. Okay, but now finally comes the solution to the problem. So the solution is that we can now subscribe to the publisher by passing in the subscriber function as an argument. Now in practice, that means that as soon as the program loads, the init function is called, which in turn immediately calls the add_handler_render function from the view. And that is possible, remember, because the controller does in fact import both the view and the model, right? Now anyway, as we call add_handler_render, we pass in our control recipes function as an argument. So essentially, we subscribe control recipes to add_handler_render. And so at this point, the two functions are basically finally connected. And so now add_handler_render listens for events using the add_event_listener method as always. And then as soon as the event actually happens, the control recipes function will be called as the callback function of add_event_listener. Or, in other words, as soon as the publisher publishes an event, the subscriber will get called. Alright, and this is how we implement event listeners and event handlers in the MVC architecture. So this will allow us to keep the handler in the controller and the listener in the view. And by that, keeping everything nicely separated. So in summary, the handler subscribes to the publisher, which is the listener in this case, and then as the publisher publishes an event, the subscriber is executed. And if you want to think even deeper about this and are really interested in this, then notice how there is actually a profound difference between a certain arbitrary, like function A, simply calling function B directly, and function A receiving function B as an input in order to then call that input function. So this is all about control. In the first scenario, function A is in control. However, in the second scenario, function A has no control. So it simply has to execute whatever function it receives. So if you want, reflect a little bit on that and see that this is exactly what the publisher-subscriber pattern is actually all about. But anyway, leaving that theory aside now, let's go back to our code and implement all of this. And so with everything we just learned about the publisher-subscriber pattern, actually now implementing it should be the easiest part, right? So let's simply grab this code, so cutting it actually, and then here we will create a new method, and let's just put it somewhere, let's say here. And so this will be our add_handler_render method that we just talked about. So add_handler_render, because this is going to be for rendering the recipe right at the beginning, right? And then this method, which remember is the publisher, basically needs to get access to the subscriber. And so that in this case is the handler function. All right. And so then we can simply paste that in here. And then here, of course, we don't know about control recipes, but we know about the handler. And so that's actually it for this function. So of course, it is not a private method because it needs to be part of the public API of this object so that we can then call it in the controller, right? And so let's actually do that now. So we can get rid of this now, and we will want to do this right in the beginning. So let's create an init function here, actually like this. And then we simply call it right at the beginning. So only once. And actually we could simply put all the code also here in the global scope, but I think it's a bit cleaner to have a separate function for this. That's recipe view dot add handler render. And so now we simply pass in control recipes. And that's actually it. With this, we just implemented the publisher-subscriber pattern. For some reason, we're still getting these errors here. let's get rid of this alert here actually, and simply do a console.log here. Okay, but now let's go and see if this actually works. We're still having our slow network. Oh, and here we have some problem, apparently, with the timeout. So let's go quickly fix that here in the helpers. So we saw that here it said undefined, like after undefined second. So maybe this variable here doesn't exist. So maybe it's kind of misspelled. So let's see in the config. Well, it looks right. Yeah, it is the same. Well, let's see again. And so this apparently happens immediately for some reason here. So what if we put it back to some normal number? Well, then it works, which is very weird because this is in fact also 10. So let's see what we get here as we log timeout seconds. Oh, but I'm actually right now seeing the problem. So this is not helpers, it is config. So we are importing ourselves here. So that was the problem. Let's put everything back. And you see that now it is working. Even with the hash change event. And so that means that we did now successfully implement the publisher subscriber pattern. Okay, and so let's quickly recap what exactly is happening here. So we can also take a look at our final diagram here. And here I actually have the event here in the controller because that is actually where it is handled. And so I think that in this diagram, this makes it a little bit easier to actually understand the flow of the program. So anyway, as we start the program, so then the init function runs, and it will then immediately run add handler render, right? So it is this function here. And it's this function that is actually listening for events right here in the view where it actually makes sense. Now, as we call this method here, so in the controller, we pass in the controller function or the handler function that we want to get executed as soon as the event happens, right? And here we then receive that function as being called handler. And so that's what we then call as soon as the event happens, right? And so again, in our diagram, that's exactly what we have here. So that's why I have this dotted line here, which stands for data flow. So we are passing in the control recipe function as the handler here. And that is the whole reason why the method here is called add handler render. So because we are using it to in fact add a handler function, and in this case, it is for rendering the recipe in the first place. And then later on, we will actually have other add handler methods. Okay, and so it's crucial that you understand this logic here before you can move on any further in this project. But I hope that with all this explanation, this became all really clear and also obvious why we had to do it like this. I mean, of course, we don't really have to do it. So we are, of course, in charge of our own code. But in order to correctly implement the MVC architecture, this is the best way of doing it. And so again, then we can keep everything nicely separated into model, controller, and view without any overlapping responsibilities. All right, so we have all of this structure here now nicely set up. Everything is nicely separated. And so from now on, all we have to do is to basically use this structure to implement all of the missing features of our application. And so, again, really make sure that you understand everything that we did so far, especially regarding the implementation of our architecture. And then once you are really done with understanding that, let's go straight to the next video.